Young people in and around Southsea either going to public houses or leaving clubs.
Laurent Giquet, who works in the bar where we were meeting, told us he'd been attacked. Others we met here agreed with him that club life has made Southsea more dangerous.
First thing I knew, I was on a car being kicked, then I was on the floor protecting my head.
For no reason at all?
For no reason, just walking out of the premises.
I wouldn't like to be out on my own on a Friday or Saturday night in this vicinity at either the times the pubs close or the clubs close.
This also has a bad effect on tourism in the area, because if the people can't walk around without being accosted or hearing bad language, then they're not going to go out and bring their children with them.
I think it's a lack of policing. When I was assaulted, we were told on that night there was only one police van patrolling the whole of Southsea, which is a big area.
Over at police headquarters in Hamble, there's a ceremony to mark the launch of the local branch of the Black Police Association. The Chief Constable, Paul Kernigan, is aware of the public concern at rising crime, but advises that one set of figures on violent crime may be misleading. Police have been concentrating on race-hate crime, and if more such crimes are being reported, that could be a positive step. But the figures are still going the wrong way.
Much more importantly than figures is public perception. That's what really concerns me, is not only the reality that people feel our streets are more dangerous than in fact they are.
So if the figures are going the wrong way, why is that?
Prosperity, ironically, actually plays a part in it. Our figures will indicate over a long period of time, in times of recession, burglary will go up. In times of relative prosperity, there are more street offences, if I can put it that way, people out, assaults in the street.
I don't know, you have to ask somebody in there.
Back on the late shift, there are more problems. There's been fighting at a function at Portsmouth Football Ground, and arrests will later be made. Tonight, 30 officers are covering the whole of Southsea and southern Portsmouth, and that's more than on most nights. Government pledged, of course, there would be more police on the beat. What's happened in Hampshire?
The Home Office has announced an additional 133 officers for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. However, I have to say, I am finding it extremely difficult to recruit officers given the package on offer to new entrants. That is something that's got to be looked at.
So you've got the money here for more police, but you can't recruit?
We have a very good reputation as a force, so the only factor I can isolate to explain the reticence of high quality people is that they don't feel the package for new entrants is appropriate.
They're not being paid enough?
In simple terms, no, they're not.
There are two sides to the government's policy of getting tough on crime and its causes. Long-term strategies involve police and local authorities working together to reduce crime. Here again, Southsea and Portsmouth have had financial help. This rundown area, Paulsgrove, will benefit from a £1 million scheme to improve health and education. Other schemes help with CCTV cameras or programmes for persistent offenders. The local authority insists it's the right approach.
I think the important thing about all this is to take a long-term view. This business of the underlying causes of crime must be addressed, and those aren't about quick fixes. We can have short-term, good, practical things to do, but the underlying and long-term initiatives take longer to have a payoff.
Beside those long-term strategies, there have been a whole spate of recent Get Tough proposals designed to show that Labour is aware of the electorate's fears on crime. The rise in crime figures could well lead to more headline-grabbing ideas. But is this the right approach?
The current government ought to have the strength and courage of its own convictions. It came in with a strategy on crime and disorder, which, is a long-term strategy. It doesn't fit an electoral cycle. We know for a fact, because we've been involved with it, that most local authorities and police are looking for a programme of 3 to 4 years. And quick fixes are not going to solve anything. They might appeal to the average Daily Mail reader and Middle England, but they're not actually going to produce a solution. What will, we think, is the kind of initiative which they themselves, introduced back in 1998.
Back on the Southsea nightclub beat, the police have arrested yet another man for being drunk and disorderly and possible possession of drugs. He has to be restrained at the police station. With the new crime figures showing a dramatic rise in some areas, there will no doubt be more calls for the government to be tough on crime, with the danger perhaps that long-term strategies of being tough on the causes are overlooked.
Robin Denslow there. A little earlier this evening, I talked to the Home Office Minister, Charles Clarke, and I started by asking him whether the inquiry to find out who leaked Tony Blair's memo was making any progress.
I have no idea. It's the Prime Minister's leak inquiry. He conducts it, and no doubt you'll get all the information from number 10 that you need.
No one's been picked up inside Downing Street yet?
Not that I'm aware of.
Are you embarrassed by the tone of this memo, by the way it focuses with and seems almost obsessed with presentation?
Well, I don't accept that. In fact, I'm not embarrassed by the tone at all. I think the fact the Prime Minister is taking a personal involvement in this issue and is prepared to discuss it internally in government is a sign of good government, prepared to look to the future and try and address the issues in an effective way.
But the phrase eye-catching initiative is a presentational phrase, isn't it?
No, if you're saying that presentation is an aspect of what he's concerned about, you're right, but that's true of every politician, certainly including me, certainly including the Home Secretary. But I think all politicians have to be concerned with presentation of their policies as well as their practical implementation.
But don't you think, Charles Clarke, that this memo is, the theme that threads its way through it is presentation all the way through? That what he's concerned with is the image of the government rather than what it's doing?
I think that is the total reverse of the truth. I think what he believes entirely is getting the government to change the way things have been done, right across the whole range. One talks of causes of crime, how we deal with children in care so they don't go into crime, how we deal with drugs, how we deal with alcohol, how we deal with domestic violence, all these things, how we address the actuality and move it forward.
You mentioned toughness, and tomorrow we're going to see new crime figures released, which we understand will show an increase in violent crime that may even be beyond the 10% increase that people were trailing 2 weeks ago. Does that blow up the Labour slogan, tough on crime, tough on the causes?
Not at all. What the figures will show tomorrow is that though we've done reasonably well in areas like burglary and vehicle crime, we still have a very long way to go in areas of violent crime. Now, some of that's for bad reason, that violent crimes have gone up in certain areas, for example, robberies. Some of it's for good reason, that in areas like domestic violence, racial violence, sexual violence, people are reporting crime far more, as we are in fact encouraging them to do. Now, there's a mix of those different impetuses within the violent crime figures when they come out. But I'd be the first to say that we have to address and tackle violent crime as effectively as we possibly can.
Well, why is it not happening?
Well, it is happening. We've already taken a number of initiatives, many of which have already been announced, so I won't bore you by re-announcing them now, to address specifically the questions on violent crime. Actually, those initiatives that I'm talking about, for example, the 20 million on burglaries, on robberies, for example, the initiatives on alcohol, for example, the extra police officers which Jack Straw announced last October to be recruited. None of them come into effect in time to influence the crime figures which ended in March 2000, which are being published tomorrow.
So you're suggesting that you feel that they will make a substantial increase in violent crime? You can't know that.
No, of course I can't know that. But what I'm signalling to you, Jeremy, is first that we think violent crime is a serious problem. Secondly, we have a whole series of measures which we have already announced to deal with that, and there'll be more still to come. Thirdly, we hope, and for my part I believe, that the impact of those further measures will be to reduce violent crime figures in the future. Now, of course, I may be wrong, but that's what we're working towards, to reduce it, which is what I think every right-thinking person would want to support.
Do you accept that people who've perhaps been a victim of violent crime may be staggered to see a minister coming on television 3 years after you were elected and confronted with crime figures which may be very worrying indeed, to hear the minister saying there are some things in the pipeline?
Actually, I said there were decisions which had already been taken, but I said that the implications are for the future. There are things we did before, immediately after we came into office, which I think will have a very big impact. The Crime and Disorder Act, for example. But, Jeremy, it would be completely dishonest of me to say to you and put my hand on my heart and say we've solved the issues of violent crime. Patently we haven't. Violent crime is still going up too fast, and patently we have to bring it down. That's a very, very important priority for the government. And by the way, going back to your initial point, one which is very important to the Prime Minister and right at the heart of government.
Well, going back to that point and back to the memo as well, you don't accept the thesis that the memo is obsessed with presentation, but there'll be people who are seeing the violent crime figures tomorrow, listening to you tonight, recalling the Labour slogan, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, and thinking, oh, well, that was another slogan that doesn't mean anything.
Well, they're entitled to think that if they wish to do so.
They've got evidence, haven't they?
Well, they haven't got evidence, actually.
The crime figures.
What I'm trying to say to you is that in key areas of crime, certain crimes are going down. Important crimes like burglary, vehicle crime are going down. I'm saying in one important area, that of violent crime, it is going up. And we are, some for good reason, as I say, because we're positively encouraging increased reporting of domestic violence, racial crime, sexual crime. And that is what we're determined to continue doing, despite the impact on increased violent crime figures, because we need people to be able to admit that they've had these crimes committed against them. But in other areas where it shouldn't be going up, it is going up. And so we are seeking to address it. Now, I'm the last person to say, Jeremy, it would be ridiculous for me to do so, as I said before, that everything's rosy in the garden. It's not. What I am saying is we're dealing with the issue as strongly and effectively as we can, and that is what we're determined to continue doing.
Charles Clark, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
3 men known as the M25 gang were released on appeal today after serving 12 years of long sentences for robbery and murder. In Court 7 at the High Court, the judgment took more than 2 hours to read out and was remarkable. First of all, the judge acknowledged that having lost their first appeal, the men had gone to the European Court of Human Rights, which decided the original trial did violate the Human Rights Convention. But the judge pointed out that that did not necessarily mean the convictions were unsafe. And then when he did quash them, he said that didn't mean the men were innocent. I was at the High Court to see it all happen. Free after more than a decade behind bars, Raphael Rowe and Michael Davis emerged from the court understandably angry at what they said was a terrible miscarriage.
Would never have happened. I was 19 years old when they put me in prison. I'm 32 years old now. 12 years of my life lost, gone, forever. I'll never, ever get those years back.
Randolph Johnson, who separately had pleaded guilty to rape, came out on his own later and was more subdued. So tell us what your reaction is to what's happened today.
Very pleased. Alhamdulillah.
Did you think it was you were going to have your conviction quashed?
Yes.
What was the most powerful piece of evidence, do you think, that caused it to be quashed?
It was the non-disclosure of evidence by the police. Yeah, the non-disclosure of evidence by the police.
And that was at the heart of the judgment. The police failed to tell the defence that one of the key prosecution witnesses, Norman Duncan, was actually an informant who'd been paid a police fee and stood to get a £10,000 reward for giving evidence. The judge pointed out that Duncan had kept one of his first encounters with the police secret. He said because he was concealing his status as an informant, he was also forced to lie about what had taken place in a subsequent 38-minute interview. The judge said that could only have been in collusion with the police, and he said it amounts to no less than a conspiracy to give perjured evidence. Now, the family are out of the court and celebrating behind us now, but some of them were horrified at the judge's final words. This is not a finding of innocence, he said. Far from it. The spirit of celebration was blunted by that.
The important thing here was that we had a series of lying witnesses, and in particular one witness who was paid the grand sum of some £10,000 for giving evidence. I think that's pretty horrific if, when that was the case and we didn't know about it.
Can you tell us what you make of this judge's final sentence when he said this is not a finding of innocence? Far from it?
Well, I mean, the judge doesn't have to find anyone innocent. He has to find out the conviction is unsafe. I think what he's saying...
He seems to be suggesting it's a bad trial but a good verdict.
No, I don't think he's suggesting that at all. I think he's suggesting that there is evidence that had to be answered. I think what he was then went on to say is that there couldn't possibly be a retrial given the length of time. I'm telling you now that Raphael Rowe would have liked a retrial. He would want those witnesses put back on the stand. He would want to confront lying witnesses, as would I.
The judgment was, I thought, peculiarly graceless and unnecessary in the sense that the judge himself said all they were doing was reviewing the process. They found the process wanting, then he should have shut up. But to say what he did about these boys' innocence, I think, was unacceptable.
How are you feeling now? The judgment left a cloud over Surrey police too. They said they were bemused by it. Officers, they said, had acted fully in accord with the law at that time.
In respect of this particular issue about collusion to commit perjury, it would be fair to say that we are fairly bemused by the comments of the court. We intend to seek further clarification.
There was another fascinating aspect to the case, only revealed today. During the trial, a juror had used his free time to visit one of the crime scenes, apparently out of curiosity. This carried the danger of him introducing facts to the jury's deliberations, which had not been heard in the courtroom. The Crown Prosecution Service noted the seriousness of what had happened.
The Court of Appeal have overturned these convictions because they found that there were two material irregularities at the original trial. The first was that the jury foreman visited the murder scene and communicated this visit to at least one other member of the jury. It's impossible to now know the effect of this visit on the trial process. The second material irregularity was the failure by the prosecution to disclose certain information at the original trial.
The men had been jailed for life for 3 violent attacks on the night of the 15th of December 1988, which left one man dead and one man seriously wounded. 10 years later, the BBC's Rough Justice programme investigated the safety of the convictions. The programme first revealed the hidden story behind Norman Duncan, the police's informant. In a reconstruction, it showed Duncan visiting his police contact. The BBC had previously secretly recorded an interview in a pub with Duncan, in which he said he had given the police the crucial evidence.
I gave the police the guys' names and addresses. That's never been publicised though, but I was the actual informant. No, but I just put 2 and 2 together. I gave him the registration number of these 2 cars, which weren't publicised at all. And he sort of like looked at it. Jesus Christ, so I think you better come with me. So he said, you're willing to give a statement? I said, do you mind?
Me and Shane Griffin were in the kitchen area when Raphael Rowe came down the stairs.
The full story about Duncan, about who he was and the money he was offered, was never revealed to the defence. Crucially, he told the police it was Rowe and Davis and another man, but not Johnson, who were responsible for the crimes. Later at the trial, he changed his story. If the defence had known what he'd first told the police, then they would have been able to undermine his credibility. In the judgment today, the failure to disclose the real story of Norman Duncan was a major factor in making the convictions unsafe. And the police's suppression of this story, the judge said, amounted to a conspiracy to give perjured evidence. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Assistant Chief Constable Peter Fahy of Surrey Police. I asked him what he made of the judge's ruling that Surrey Police had colluded in a conspiracy to give perjured evidence.
Well, we're somewhat puzzled by those words, and we are going to seek clarification from the Court of Appeal as to exactly what they meant. We cooperated fully with the investigation carried out on behalf of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and that investigation found that there was no evidence that our officers had colluded to mislead the jury or had tried to coerce Mr Duncan in any way. So we are rather puzzled by the judgment of the Court of Appeal, and we intend to seek clarification.
I don't understand why you're puzzled, because the judge explains it. He says that your informant was concealing his status, so he was forced to lie about what had taken place in an interview, and that could only have been in collusion with the police. It's perfectly clear.
Well, we're puzzled because certainly the inquiry by the Criminal Cases Review Commission did not find that he had lied. What was important
here... Well, he did lie. He lied in court.
What was important here is that the police officers at that time were following the procedure in relation to the use of an informant. There was no facility at that time for officers to go to a judge ex parte and tell the judge that there was an informant in the case.
So a man stands up in court, he lies, and the police know he's lying, and they say nothing because they think the law is backing them?
No, there is no evidence that Mr Duncan actually lied in the court. At one point we did have our officers ready to be cross-examined. The defence decided not to actually use them in cross-examination.
The judgment said he lied. He covered up the first meeting that he'd had with you. He said, he told the jury he was not arrested until the 22nd of December. That was a lie, wasn't it?
Well, we're puzzled at that because there is actually no transcript. No transcript was taken of the original trial, so we would be interested to know how it is known what he actually said in front of the court. We intend to seek clarification upon that. The crucial thing is there was an exhaustive investigation carried out by Greater Manchester Police on behalf of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and they found no evidence whatsoever of any impropriety. Those officers were following the procedure, the law, which was in place at the time of the original trial.
Explain something else then that came up in the Court of Appeal today, which is called about a message 111,
yes,
which was a recording of the first, or record of the first thing that your informant said to you. And he named 3 people. He named Davis, Rowe, and a third man, Jason Cooper. And then he later changed that. He changed the name of the third man. And the police never said that he changed his original story.
Well, again, all the rules about disclosure were changed as a result of the Ward case in 1994.
Forget the rules for a second. Isn't it quite important that this key witness changed his story, and you didn't tell anybody.
It is important when you're using the standards of today. Those officers were applying the standards which were in place at the time of the original trial, and the rules of disclosure were not changed until 1994.
But you keep talking about the rules, but don't you have an instinctive feeling that it's wrong for you not to tell the court that your key witness has changed his story?
I have an instinctive feeling that it's right that officers follow the law, procedure, the practice which was in place at that time.
Well, the prosecution said that they would, if they'd known, they would have told the defence that it was an important fact.
They can say that now, but it was not procedure at that time for that sort of information to be disclosed to the defence. That has all changed as a result of the Ward case.
You see, you have a choice here, don't you? Because you can actually say, message 111 is important. There's then the question of the defendant to the informant being offered reward money and a payment by the police and so on. And you can just say, look, this is all going against the principles of natural justice. We shouldn't be using this guy in this case when there's 3 people facing life sentences. Why did you say that?
I would totally agree with you, but that's using the standards of today, and we are certainly very pleased.
Why are the standards of today any different from 10 years ago?
Because that was the law and practice and procedure that was in place at the time as a result of stated cases, as a result of the way that the law was administered in this country.
But we're talking at slight cross purposes here, because I'm asking you, instinctively as a policeman, to agree that the situation that you allowed to happen in that case was unfair to the 3 defendants. And you keep saying, oh, that's what the rules said. Well, they didn't say that, because you needn't have used that informant.
No, of course we had to use that informant.
Why?
That informant was providing the main lines of evidence.
He changed his story, and he'd been offered money, and you didn't tell anybody about the money he'd been offered.
No, the Greater Manchester inquiry looked into this in great detail. Number one, there is no evidence that Duncan was motivated by money. He actually contradicted. He said that in an interview in the Rough Justice programme.
Of course he would.
The rules that covered reward were fully complied with at that time. The rules on disclosure were complied with at that time. We followed all the law and procedure which was in place at that time. There was no facility at that time for us to go to the judge before the trial and say there's an informant in this case. Again, that comes out in the Court of Appeal hearing, and they said if we'd approached the judge in those circumstances, it would have been refused and it would have been ruled as improper.
The Criminal Cases Review Commission in 1997 did a review into this case, and they listed 4 documents you failed to disclose. 4 important documents, which were some of the first descriptions of the attackers by their victims. Documents that describe the attackers, at least one of them, as white, when all 3 people in court were black. You didn't disclose them.
All the witness statements, which again showed exactly those inconsistencies, were put before the original trial.
You didn't disclose those documents.
And that issue was covered in great depth in the original trial, in the Court of Appeal hearing in 1993, and indeed was essentially disregarded by the Court of Appeal today.
Yes, but why didn't you disclose the documents?
Because again, that was not the procedure. The procedure at that time was to disclose witness statements. We disclosed all the witness statements. Over 1,100 witness statements were disclosed to the defence, and that included the inconsistencies that were there between what the witnesses, the description the witnesses had originally given, and the appearance of the 3 men that were eventually charged.
The impression you're giving, Mr. Fye, is that you know the rules back to front, but you don't have an instinctive sense of fairness.
No, I would totally reject that. We are very clear in Surrey Police that the job of a detective is to search for the truth. What we were working with them was a legal system at that time that had very clear rules about disclosure, the use of informants, the use of rewards, and we complied with that procedure. I would say again, there was no facility for us to go to the judge before the trial and say that you need to know that there's an informant in this case. That facility was not available, and we are certainly very happy that the law has now been changed, because it puts our officers in a much better position that they can be truthful with the court, with the jury, with the judge.
Mr. Fye, thanks very much indeed. In a moment, Alex Salmond is stepping down after leading the SNP for 10 years. Why did he decide to go now? But first, a look at today's other news.
Welcome to Wales to 11, I'm Sian Lloyd. The clock's ticking towards the largest economic boost for a generation in Wales. If all goes well in the government's spending review tomorrow, we could be on course for £1 billion of European aid over the next decade. Tonight, a special report on how Ireland has benefited from the extra money already. More than a fortnight after Sarah Payne disappeared, the body of a little girl has been found some 10 miles from where Sarah went missing. Police in West Sussex say the body was found this morning by a member of the public. Sarah's family was informed of the discovery soon afterwards. The body was found at Pulborough near a public footpath next to the A29. Downing Street's launched an official inquiry after a memo from the Prime Minister intended for his cabinet colleagues and closest advisers was leaked to the press. In it, Tony Blair said the public saw the government as soft on crime, weak on family issues and generally out of touch. The mother of the boy slapped by his head teacher in Monmouthshire says she shouldn't be jailed but should be punished in some other way. The woman, who can't be named to protect the identity of her son, says the boy has been suffering nightmares since his ordeal. Meanwhile, several of the boy's neighbours are supporting Marjorie Evans and calling on the Education Authority to reinstate her. We return now to our top story and the announcement tomorrow of the government spending review. We'll learn whether the Chancellor has provided the match funding needed to unlock more than £1 billion of European aid for the poorest parts of Wales. Well, our neighbours across the Irish Sea have had Objective 1 funding since the late 1980s. So what difference has it made to the Republic's economy? From Ireland, Roger Pinney sends this special report.
The Ballymun estate on the outskirts of Dublin, not the usual image of modern Ireland and its Celtic tiger economy. With its drug problems and crime, Ballymun is notorious. The rock band U2 have even written songs about the place.
7 towers